one of the things that I think that I can get
No worries.
that I can completely get on the same page with as you is I truly believe that Brian Kohberger is involved. I just don't think that he did the unaliving.
Yeah. Yeah, there's too many reasons to. I mean, I really, one of the early videos I did was the idea that maybe he was just the getaway driver, and I think that he was. I guess to sum up my theory was is that being a Crim J student, somebody who wanted to pull off the murders got to know Brian Kohberger and basically said, if I wanted to do this, how would I get away with it? You know, and he had the ability to be like, well, if I were going to do it, here's how I would do it, kind of thing. So there's a part of me that thinks that Brian Kohberger may have just simply assisted somebody with figuring out how to get away with it, but may not have actually been the person who went into the house. And if he did go into the house, I'm almost certain he wasn't the only one who went into the house. That's my personal theory, I guess, on it, if you will.
Well, and that's kind of one of the things too. I actually I went back and I made a progression kind of my theory and or theories and how my brain worked. And so I think that this gives kind of people a good insight into how my brain works, because how I started was I saw this mainstream story and I think, like most people, was like, holy shit, this is insane. What is going on? You know, I sat there, watched all the original stuff come out. And then obviously as the court cases and everything else started coming out, I'm like, God, this seems way too like methodical, like Jason Bourne-esque type stuff for one guy to do it. And then it's interesting how you started talking about the getaway driver. And that's where I started looking up an accomplice. And I started looking at the path that Brian Kohberger drove that night. And I started looking on Google Maps and a bunch of stuff, and I'm like, where would Kohberger potentially stop or dump the evidence? Like, you know, that was me trying to be a TikTok detective. And then I go into the court documents, and this is right around the time when Dylan starts talking about she saw what she thought was a firefighter, but then she was like, I don't know if it's real or whatnot. Well, I started thinking about what the hell would look like a firefighter. And, you know, you start looking and it's like, okay, well, maybe heavy duty Carhartt, something like that. And then I looked up like a welder suit. Then I'm like, what are the odds that there's a welder shop or a welding shop or a metalwork fabrication shop along this route? Well, there's three of them. There's three of them. And there's also, going back to the point of like, how does one person do this with a fixed blade K-bar? Well, on one of these welding shops websites, there's a ton of giant swords, a ton of giant homemade weapons. And I just started thinking, I'm like, well, if that was the case, and people are, I believe it was Kaylee's father saying that the wounds are all different. Maybe there was like a custom weapon that had two sides to it. You guys can probably figure out the rest of how my thought process went to where I started diving into it. Well, then I start going down the rabbit hole. And again, not to go off on a tangent too much, but obviously when I'm posting this stuff and talking about it now, my goal is not to defame anybody. And this is theory, right? This is not fact, but I will say it is very odd that the same person in the photo with all those swords and stuff is the same age as the victims, right there around about, was 2 days later camping about an hour and a half north deep in the woods with all of his buddies, and no evidence or anybody else was really interviewed right after the crime, and he wasn't at the scene. So I just was like, damn, that would make a whole lot of sense, because that welding shop could incinerate everything. And if it was a single use custom weapon, you're never going to find the Schmurder weapon. So that's how that theory progressed.
Let me say this. I love your mind. You were spot on to start thinking about those things. That one of the things that I saw when I was watching your content, it was like, this dude knows how to think. You're right. Like, why did he take the route that he did on the way back to Pullman? Why didn't he take the more direct route? Why did he go? And so you start looking into it, right? Like, well, where did he go? And those are amazing questions. And that whole welder theory has just super intrigued me ever since I heard you say. You're like the only guy I've heard say that. So kudos to you. That was amazing. That was, I feel like you're really onto something there.
Well, and I can appreciate that. And one of the things that I do genuinely try to like pride myself in doing is I try to come up with all of like my own theories. Like I'm like, if I'm going to really go in on it, and it's look, guys, let's just address the obvious. Like we're all sitting here in like a true crime chat. Like it's a little bit morbid to think about. Like it's a hobby to try to figure out this stuff, right? Like let's address the elephant in the room. But in my mind, I'm like, if I'm going to do it, I'd like to do it through and through myself. Now, it's not to say that I don't hear stuff on TikTok. I'm not going to be that arrogant and say that there's not things that influence how my brain thinks, but I can appreciate that. And there's a lot of very, very creative people on this app and platform. And there's also a lot of extremely very closed-minded people on this app and platform. So it's quite the dichotomy. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I want to kind of backtrack because you have always been, and I get it, especially with TikTok, you have not named who you think is around the same age as the victims that works at that welding shop, and so I have to be fair, I haven't figured it out myself who it is, but I have all kinds of thoughts about who could be connected to this thing, and so I wish you could say, but I understand why you don't say. So let me say that at the start, but. You know, like I said, one of the things I also appreciate you, not to swing off your proverbial, you know what, but one of the things I also appreciate about you is that you entertained a lot of different thoughts, right? So you've got thoughts that suggest, for example, that maybe there aren't any victims and that they're in witness protection. And then you also look down the avenue of maybe they were killed and here's who, and I hate to use that word. So let me try to find some ways that we can get avoided from TikTok. But the point being is that I love the fact that you can look at many different angles, and that's the same thing that I like to do, and more so maybe than even me. You really look at a lot of different angles, and so before we get started in anything, I want to say I really really love your content and how you can think outside the box and look at multiple theories, and you're not married to any one theory.
Thank you. That honestly, that really is a very like those. That's awesome, and I can appreciate that so much because a lot of times it's like, well, didn't you just think it was this or didn't you just think it was that? And it's like, look, guys, at the end of the day, I'm also a very firm believer that this is either going to be forever the initial mainstream narrative that was under lock and key within a couple hours of Kohberger being arrested, or we're never going to know the full truth. So in my head, I don't think that I'm doing anything other than trying to answer questions by looking through different lenses that nobody's been able to answer in the past. And that's where, with the welder and the no schmurder, with, why were Maddie and Kaylee found in the same bed. And then I can start talking about the right of the twins. I mean, also, I might add, I enjoy learning still. And I think that that's a gift that I have as I've become an adult, is that I did not ever expect that I truly enjoy like reading and learning. I think what it really just had to click for me was when it was on what I wanted to learn about and what I wanted to look into. So thank you for the kind words. Like I said, I'm happy to give you the floor and kind of steer the conversation. And so with that being said, if there's anything that you want to talk about first, go for it.
Yeah, sure. Like there's one thing, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a TikToker by the name of Drip Drop who does Crime Circus. Are you familiar with that show?
So I've been told to look into the Crime Circus. Like I've just like dabbled, I guess you could say. I haven't gone like deep on it.
Fair. So one of the things that really struck me about your welder theory was Drip Drop showed, and you've talked about before about the Buddy, the dog that was mutilated before the Idaho 4 murders. And how, and granted, you focus a little bit more on the rituals thing. And by the way, I don't want to discredit your ritual thing. Like I want to talk about that and give it some fair shake, right? But what was interesting was one of the things that they showed, Drip Drop showed, was a shot from Brent Kopaka's room, which there was a machete that looked like it was a custom-made machete, like at a welding shop, somebody that knows something about metal. And so they had this big, fancy, freaking huge blade. And as you have pointed out, some of the wounds on the victims don't indicate that it was done by a K-bar. It could have been done by a much more, a machete, something, or an axe, or something to that effect. And I hate to say this because I understand this is gruesome and it's hard for people to hear. And so I don't want to get into the gore. But the point being is that when you started bringing the welder theory and you mentioned somebody that had images of weapons in the background, custom made weapons. I thought, holy shit, this looks like Kopaka's image with the machete that's custom made. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, or are you willing to give some thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, we can absolutely dive into that. And one of the things too, and I would be curious if there would be any way, because look, the guy that's in the photo that's holding all these weapons, it's the same dude. And look, this is weird that I did this. Okay, it's weird. I did this. I'm looking up and I'm trying to figure out who this guy is. That's a complete stranger halfway across the country from me. But at the end of the day, like, he's, tall, muscular build, holding giant weapons. And if you think about, if you're going to go in there and have to do this, I mean, I just think about using a sword or using essentially a steak knife, it's pretty incredible. So yeah, we can absolutely dive into it. And, as far as with the machete and stuff, I'm just, even that, with not having found the Schmurder weapon, and we're going off of just a sheath, we're assuming that it was the original K-bar that came in that sheath that was used. That is an extremely common, one time what we did on live, when I do my live digs, is we looked into how many of those K-bars are bought every month on Amazon. Amazon stops tracking it.
It's a super, super, super common weapon. Everybody has a K-bar. It's like one of the most common knives. So yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean a whole lot on its own. Granted, it looks horrible, right? If you got a guy that's convinced of or convicted of committing a murder with a K-bar knife, and he purchased a K-bar knife, that looks bad. But everybody, okay, not everybody, but a large portion of the population owns a K-bar knife. It's a very, very popular knife, like you said. You're muted from me. I hear you. I see your lips moving, but I don't hear you talking.
Oh, sorry about that. I forgot to turn it back on. But yeah, it looks absolutely terrible. And again, I go back to two, like, especially it's that specific model. It's Amazon's choice, for God's sakes. I mean, that's the thing. We have this guy who's a criminology student, and I just find it so weird how everybody gives him so much credit in his ability to know what he should have done, how he should have done it, how he can get away. And then they just fall back on, well, he made mistakes. Well, it seems like he made just about damn near every little mistake that's actually a huge mistake that you could make if you were so smart.
Right. So I'm so glad you brought that up. So there's this competing narrative in the public, right? Which is that, oh, well, he's a criminal justice student, so he knows how to get away with murder. And yet he makes dumbass mistakes, like leaving his cell phone to be tracked and turning it off before going to the crime, and turning it back on when he's leaving the crime. Like, how do you say both? That he's so smart, he knows how to get away with the crime, and yet makes dumb mistakes as well. So I agree that it's a conflicting idea to have in your head at the same time.
And that the defense is arguing about him being on the spectrum. And it's just one of those things where it is a completely conflicting narrative. That in itself, just that point that we said, one of the things that I'll fall back on too is, like, we're going to dive into a lot of stuff, guys, like in the chat, like, let's be real. If there's like 2 or 3 of these things, which we're going to touch on a lot of, like, I guess, sub aspects of each of these main parts. But if just like 2 or 3 happen, typically people start scratching their head and they're like, what the hell is going on? We could probably, everybody in the chat, I could say right now, if you guys wanted to type in something that's like, what is something that is unusual for this case that happened that people have deemed normal? People are going to rattle off a ton of them. And it's still just like head in the sand. If somebody tells you the sky's green, oh, yep, it's green. It's just, it's weird.
For me, I spent a lot of time. I mean, I realize, I feel like this is a dangerous area for me to talk about on TikTok. So I'll try to figure out how to say this. But I feel like a lot of friends and family of Kopaka are on TikTok, and they tend to flag people who talk about him because they're tired of people accusing this guy. But if you don't look into Kopaka, I feel like you're missing a major part of the story. I fundamentally have a hard time believing that it's just random coincidence that both families come from Pennsylvania and both families end up in, I swear to God, I live hours away from Pullman, Washington. that these two guys came from Pennsylvania and ended up in Podunk, Pullman, Washington. I'll tell you, those places are nowhere on the map. They are small ass places. Now, granted, WSU was specialized in criminology, and so that is a truth. And I went to psychology school. I went into psychology at WSU, so I went to campus there. So I'm a little familiar with the campus. But the point being is that you cannot convince me that two guys from Pennsylvania and their families from Pennsylvania, living within miles of each other, really end up in Pullman, Washington at the same time within months of each other, and then aren't connected in any way, shape, or form. That there's just somehow some random ass coincidence. Come on, like, how is that possible?
And they damn near share a parking lot too. That's how close they lived in the new state. That it's. Yeah, no, you absolutely crushed that point, because it's like, I've said this before, so if people in my chat have heard this, you know where I'm going with this, but it's like, what is the definition of coincidence? And it's actually a mathematical term, and it means to coincide. And it's that two angles could not fit together any other way. They have to line up perfectly. And obviously we use it as a phrase of speech that says like, oh, it's not a coincidence. But I really do think, like, even just that alone, which I would argue that could be a point of even like crime or not, that'd be like a weird coincidence. Like, if any of this with Idaho never happened, or with Idaho 4 never happened, people would still be like, wow, that's a weird coincidence. Like you just said, you're from that area. You're like, two guys from Pennsylvania out here. What the hell are they doing?
Well, I mean, so here's the thing. Like, I agree. Let me riff on that a little bit. 100%. It is possible that things in this world are coincidence, but more than likely, it's not just a coincidence. Another thing that I'm sure your listeners probably already know, but Brian Kohberger's sister was in a horror movie called 2 Days Back. Kopaka and all his friends were huge into horror films. If you look at his best friend Darren, who was on a podcast, all behind him is a huge wall of horror film stuff. They were huge into horror films. And Brian Kohberger's sister was in a horror film. And again, yes, is there coincidences in life? Yes. But come on, when you start adding all these things together, that Brian Kohberger's sister was in a horror film, all these guys were into horror films, Brent Kopaka and his friends are into horror films, and then they end up moving from Pennsylvania to Pullman, Washington within months of each other. Come on, man. At what point do you suspend disbelief?
This is why I was so excited to have you on as a guest, because I can feel the exact feeling that you have as you're saying this, because it's just like, come on. But yet there will be people that, rather than listen and just kind of logically bridge build through that, will immediately be like, oh, yep, here we go. Conspiracy this, conspiracy. No, it's effing crazy. That just what you laid out there, even if none of the unalivings happened, would be a weird story that if you bumped into somebody at a bar downtown and you started talking about, you guys would be like, what? That is freaking insanely coincidental.
Even the director of the movie, when he was told that Kohberger was implicated in a movie with killing 4 college students, and that was basically the theme of the movie 2 Days Back, which was a group of college students that get killed in the forest, he said, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, he couldn't believe it, because even he was like, you can't suspend that kind of disbelief. Like, what is this? Like, are you kidding me? So yeah, it's crazy.
Can I actually, since we're on Kopaka, and I've had a couple other guests on here, but one specifically talking offline, obviously this guy is an Army veteran, Purple Heart, and in a smaller town, I just find it odd too, in general, like the police, they're getting a call to this man's house, and the de-escalation tactics, the lack of any kind of body cam footage, obviously they end up unaliving him. He's having some sort of episode, allegedly, all of these things. I go back to, as well as like police de-escalation. It's like, okay, you got a veteran with PTSD and you're going to break through the door, and or like I used it. I was like, they use a robot dog. I don't, obviously they're not using a robot dog, but you get what I'm saying. Like, they chose the absolute worst possible way for a dude with PTSD who's a warfighter to de-escalate. And then the other part about it too, and this is mainly the point that I want to get your thoughts on. If you look into like the actual service, then after he passed, did you find it odd that a Purple Heart Army veteran with PTSD didn't get, I guess, what a classic honorary type funeral would be from at least what I've seen. And that's why I'm asking. I'm not claiming that that's 100% true. You might know more than me, but it is something that from just Googling it and looking at it, it seemed light, I guess.
So yeah, thank you for asking. So what the things that I find super effing weird with the Brent Kopaka situation is that, according to Darren Duncan, his best friend, after the SWAT team eliminated Brent Kopaka in his apartment, the family came into the room and found that his room in that place where he was staying with roommates, which, by the way, he wasn't attending college. So the question you have to ask is, what was Brent Kopaka even doing in Pullman, Washington? He wasn't going to school there. So what was he doing there? And why did he show up just about a month before the murders? That's a whole nother thing. But when Darren Duncan said, hey, we and the family were just completely confused about why his room was completely emptied of all furniture. Even his bed was gone, his dresser was gone, and all that was left was an open safe and his discharge papers from the military. It was as if the media and law enforcement wanted you to know, hey, this guy has PTSD, he was dismissed from the military, he's unstable, this is the reason why he was shot and killed. It was the narrative that they wanted to post. And his phone was factory wiped and set on the counter. And on the podcast where I have several videos about this, Darren Duncan says, hey, look, his phone was factory wiped and all of his stuff is gone except for his discharge papers. What the fuck? And this guy that's interviewing him says, that's super weird. He's like, yeah, it's super effing weird. Like, how do you explain that? Like, you can't even explain that. And then to the last thought I want to add is that Brent Kopaka's mother had a house in Lewiston, Idaho. One of the weird things in this case is that Brian Kohberger apparently made a trip the morning of the killings down to Lewiston, Clarkston area. And I don't know if you know the area, but Lewiston and Clarkston, like Lewis and Clark Expedition, they literally touch each other side by side. They're two cities, aside from a small bridge between the two. They're literally touching each other. And so Brian Kohberger is caught on camera several places in Clarkston, Washington, right next to Lewiston, where Brent Kopaka's mother happens to have a residence in that area. So I said to myself, what if Brian Kohberger somehow knows Brent Kopaka? They both come from Pennsylvania. What did he, after the murders, take Brent Kopaka down to his mother's place, where she has a place down in Lewiston, Idaho, drop him off right next door to Lewiston, Idaho? It's literally across the bridge. In fact, where they see Brian Kohberger is right next to the bridge going into Lewiston, Idaho. It's crazy shit. I don't know if you're following all that, but that's just crazy
I have
shit.
not ever heard that. I've never known that. So
Crazy shit.
That is absolutely crazy. So, wow. I don't even know I don't even know what to even say from that, because that, again, that's a narrative and a timeline crumbling right in front of your eyes, if there's anything even with that. So what was it that really got you to dive deeper into that, outside of just the curiosity? Like, was it that interview that you're like, oh yeah, what the fuck? Or how'd you figure out with the mother's house? Like, how did you find all that? Like, what was there, I guess not even how you found it, but what was your working thought process? Because that's something I've never heard.
Well, it's funny because I guess the way it started was when I heard that Brent Kopaka was shot and killed in Pullman, Washington, 1 month and 1 day after the murders of the Idaho Four. I said to myself, well, that's kind of strange. Like, what's with that? And then Darren Duncan, his best friend, goes on a podcast and he says, hey, I have a theory, by the way. I think the Moscow police thought that Brent Kopaka was involved in the Idaho Four. And I went, what? Like, he literally said, the police believed that Brent Kopaka was involved in the murders. And because of that, they were on high alert and they were quick to shoot, and they shot and killed him. And then they realized, and this was according to Darren Duncan on that podcast, which I got linked on my website. He said, I believe the cops effed up. They shot him and they killed him. And they were like, oh my God, we effed up. Then his phone was factory reset. And shortly after, within 4 days, the FBI tells Moscow Police Department that they should be looking into Brian Kohberger. And I started to ask myself, wait a minute, does Brent Kopaka know Brian Kohberger? Are these guys related? Does that explain why Brian Kohberger went down to Lewiston, Idaho? And to be fair, to answer the question of where did I get that information, my wife subscribes to a public records search, which has listings of everybody's houses. So she looked up, Brent Kopaka. And then his house, his mother, Darcy, basically owns a house in Lewiston, Idaho, owns a house in Pierce, Idaho. And so it's very close to Moscow, Idaho. And all of a sudden, holy shit, you find out she also owns a house in Pennsylvania. So these guys all came from Pennsylvania. They all lived together at the same exact time. And I was like I said, what are the effing odds of that? Come on, man. At what point do you go, what are the effing odds of that? There has to be a connection. For me, there has to be a connection.
I mean, honestly, I'm pretty mind blown right now. And I guess, just to kind of get the chat's thoughts on it too, if you don't mind, like how many people have heard that? Because like, you got all those things that he just listed out that, like I said, even if these unalivings didn't happen and you were to see somebody at a bar and just catch up and be like, wait, what? You're from there? Oh, and your mom's got a house out there? And oh, wow. And I was just down there. And that's where Brian Kohberger gets arrested right by. It's just absolutely insane. That is a lot.
I shit you not. There's a picture on Google Maps where you can Google the house that Brent Kopaka's mother owns. She's named Darcy. And I feel bad because I don't want anybody to harass the family. Let's get that out. I don't want anybody to harass the family. We don't know that Brent Kopaka was involved. So please don't harass this family. But anyways, there's a picture on Google Maps of that house. And you know what's in the parking lot? A silver Elantra. You know what doesn't look very different on cameras? The silver Elantra and a white Elantra. There's a fucking silver Elantra in the parking lot of Darcy's house. Come on, man. Like, how do we not ask these questions?
I don't know how this is the first time that I'm hearing this. I mean,
I'm glad that you get to hear something from me. That's cool.
No, it's unbelievable. And so then I guess like right now, kind of just shooting from the hip, like, okay, like how do they know each other? What would be a reasonable explanation for how they know each other? And this is not me trying to detract this and go down this route. I'm not. I'm just saying, like, right away in my head, I'm like, well, were they both assets for some part of a subcontractor for the federal government? Did they somehow have connections to it? I am curious to get your thoughts on this. I was doing some research in prep for this live tonight, knowing that the WITSEC stuff would most likely come up. Do the top state for WITSEC that I, from multiple sources, saw was Florida. Okay, like a lot of big cities will be used for it with a lot of diversity, things like that. But then the second cluster of states that are used for WITSEC are these small towns that nobody's really from in Idaho and Montana. And so I find that interesting. And like you said, what are the odds that these two guys come from Pennsylvania out there within months of the unalivings? There's what you just laid out. It also just adds on top of that. I mean, what is your thoughts on a reasonable explanation of how, or if you've ever kind of war gamed that out, how they could know each other?
So I'll tell you my theory. Now, first of all, I want to say for your credit, I think there's nothing wrong with your theory about the witness protection stuff and all that stuff. There's nothing wrong with that theory whatsoever. But here's how I linked the two. So Darren Duncan, who's the best friend of Brent Kopaka, it is obvious he's huge into horror films. Again, on the video where he's talking about his friend's death, on the wall behind him is a huge amount of horror film videos. And on that wall is pictures from It and all kinds of different horror films. They are huge. Him and his best friend, Brent Kopaka, were huge into horror films. And again, Brian Kohberger's sister, Amanda Kohberger, was in a movie called 2 Days Back. It was a horror film in which she was one of the victims, oddly enough, of college age, oddly enough, who were murdered in a forest because they stumbled upon some kind of like drug conspiracy or whatever, the kind of thing, which is interesting because even in the Idaho 4 situation, there's a lot of drug conspiracies involved. Anyways, I think that what happened was, in my opinion, was that Brent Kopaka and his friends in Pennsylvania were into the whole horror movie thing. They loved horror movies. Now all of a sudden, Brian Kohberger, his sister is in a horror movie. So now they get to know who Amanda Kohberger is. That's the sister that was in 2 days back. So now they start to get interested in, oh shit, here's this local person, and Amanda Kohberger's from Pennsylvania. She's a local person. So they start to get interested, and that's how I think they started to get connected, in my opinion. That's completely 100% a working theory. I can't prove any of that shit. So this is all speculation. But this is how I think that interest started happening.
So I mean, hey, and first of all, there's no offense taken. That's one of the things that I've prided myself on since I've started doing these. I've always said, you're not going to get kicked for disagreement. I've instructed the mods in here. The only way you're getting kicked is if you're a troll, or like, for example, somebody was like, I wish you were the only one in the house that night. Like, we're talking some just effed up stuff, right? So obviously, I don't take any disrespect to that, and I do appreciate you saying that. Just like I hope that when I ask you questions, right? Like, this is just good old, we're just two dudes talking right now, and I guess I would ask you. So, if they were going to figure it out that way, how do you think that they realized that she was from Pennsylvania? And if you said that, I apologize, but it's like that's kind of where my head went. Is like, how would you kind of figure that out? Is there like, you just start researching people because you see them in a movie? Do you think it was that big of fans of it, or because that's reasonable to me?
Let me cover a couple of things. One, there was a comment that I saw in your chat that somebody said, "Hey, Darren Duncan was never from Pennsylvania." Fair, but Brent Kopaka is from Pennsylvania, and Darren Duncan claims to be the best friend of Brent Kopaka. So fair. Darren Duncan may not have been from Pennsylvania, but he's best friends with Darren Duncan. So the question becomes about this whole movie theory thing. So again. And I understand you haven't seen it, so and no big deal. But Crime Circus, Drip Drop, kind of an interesting dude. He wears weird ass makeup and he looks a little freaky, so people kind of dismiss him because the way he looks. It's a sad thing that people judge people by their looks. But the point being is that Drip Drop pointed out that literally Brent Kopaka had an address that was within 7 miles of the community college that Brian Kohberger went to school, and about 10 miles away from DeSales University, where Brian Kohberger did his undergraduate work in college. And in fact, it was a 4-bedroom house that Brent Kopaka could not afford on his Army disability. So the question became to Drip Drop is it possible Brent Kopaka and Brian Kohberger were roommates in this house? Because Brian Kohberger was literally going to school within 7 miles of where Brent Kopaka was living. So if you can put these two guys, just on the surface, let me say this, if you can put these two guys in Pennsylvania, in a small town in Pennsylvania, at the same time, and then you can put the same two guys in Pullman, Washington. And I can't stress enough how much of a podunk place Pullman, Washington is. It is super low population. There's nothing there but the university, right? If you can put those two guys in the same places at the same times, what are the likelihoods to the average common thinking man that these two people don't know each other? And then you add in the fact that, again, Amanda Kohberger was in a horror film and that they're all into horror films. That's easy to verify. Then you kind of say, well, if Brian Kohberger is going to school right next to Brent Kopaka and he's a horror film fan and his sister is in a horror film, what are the likelihoods that those two guys aren't going to somehow make a connection? So that's kind of where I went with that.
No, look, it makes sense. You can get asked a question, and whether or not people agree with it, at least you can defend your answer and you can talk to it and speak to it as if you've looked into it. And I believe that that's like exactly what we're trying to do here. I did ask a question, and one of the questions that I did want to ask you. So I started the first half of this show with my wife that I do every Wednesday. I call it Narrative Warfare plus my wife, like in the Borat voice. So anyways, I asked her at the end of these 5 questions where I kind of get her hot take on it. And I want to ask you, if there was one piece of information that you could look behind the curtain on and get the truth about or see, what piece of information would you choose that you believe would either prove Brian Kohberger's innocence or prove Brian Kohberger's guilt?
Wow.
And chat, feel free to chime in too.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that because, again, my gut feeling is that Kohberger is involved and may have actually possibly been one of the individuals in the house, but he wasn't acting alone. I fundamentally have a problem believing that one person can unalive, if you say, and I hate that word. I hate it with a passion. But I have a fundamental problem believing that one person can kill 4 people in the space of about 8 minutes on 2 separate floors of a house and get out leaving no trace of their DNA other than a speck of DNA the size of a grain of sand. That's ridiculous to me. That's ridiculous. So I don't think that the killer, whoever it was, acted alone. And so while I believe that Kohberger probably was involved, only because there's just a lot of evidence that suggests, circumstantial, albeit, and I honestly want to reiterate, I believe in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in a court of law. I believe firmly on that. But there is a lot of circumstantial evidence that kind of puts him looking like he might be involved. So there's a part of me that believes that he's involved, but he wasn't the only one. And as I state, and I try to sum up this idea, as I state, the important thing is, do you, as the American public, give a shit whether or not you get to the truth of what mattered, or do you want to just have somebody go down for it? Does it matter to you if there was other people involved? Are you okay with them walking and being completely free of their involvement in this crime because you got a guy? Or do you want to know what really happened that night? And that's the important thing to me.
Well said. Well said, because I've always said that one of the biggest things about American culture is that we value closure more than we value the truth, because if you don't have closure, most of the time you have to face the uncomfortable truth. And that uncomfortable truth is that either investigators and judges and people in the system and figures of trust are not always very trustworthy or don't always do the right things. Or you go back to, well, why do we have a trial in the first place? And we have a trial in the first place because authority makes mistakes, and then your peers confirm whether or not it was a mistake. So, I typically, I don't go super deep on court documents. I read the court documents, but you look at the judge making the defense present their alternative suspects for the first time ever in U.S. court in a Supreme Court DP case, where that's never been done. The last time that was actually done in a government was the Mustache Man. And, you think about that, guys, and I've gone on rants about it. I'm going to try to not go on one now, but in a weird way, I don't care if Brian Kohberger is guilty or innocent. I care that the right person is brought to justice. And I also believe that an American citizen, yes, there are monsters out there. There's plenty of monsters that have committed horrific crimes that they've been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they did those crimes. It just seems like, on top of everything else that we've learned about this case and inconsistencies, if we were to take all of that out and you were to just look at from the time that Kohberger was put into custody to where he's at now, it seems like there's a shitload of unprecedented things that have happened against an American man in court when he's fighting for his life, about to be put in front of a effing firing squad. Now, also because they just changed that to their first method of execution instead of the lethal injection to go live right when he's expected to be sentenced. To me, that is the 40,000 foot view. And then you talk about how they found the DNA and the genetic DNA, like the genetic databases that are third-party consumer databases where there's no HIPAA laws because we all just blindly click the terms and condition box. And just, I could go on. People in here have probably heard me do that. But that's the bigger point, too, on top of everything else, is you guys think it's going to just stop with Kohberger after this? It never does. It never stops. That's cute if you think it's going to stop, because it won't. End rant.
I don't know. I don't know. Oh my God, dude. I don't know where to begin, because we could be talking for hours tonight. And ridiculous how much we think alike. Let me say this. The point being, just like you said, we have an American system in the judicial system that believes in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. We also believe in this fundamental principle, which is that we would rather a guilty person or two go free than one single innocent person go to jail for something that they didn't commit. And so we have to give the presumption of innocence. We have to. And so this case is ridiculous. The court of public opinion has already decided that Brian Kohberger is guilty. The guilters are out there saying, oh my God, like, what are you guys talking about? There's no question. Then why do we even have a trial system? You have to believe in the presumption of innocence. You have to. So, I mean, again, there's so many things you said. I could riff on for freaking 2 hours on what you just said. But 100%, brother, I'm with you on that. Like, we have to believe in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in this country.
Yes, and I actually, in preparation for this, I printed off just a couple of the I printed off the last 3 court developments spanning from April 4th up to April 12th. And I mean, you look at even just, I'm just going to read the top like headlines. You got defense files motion to dismiss DNA evidence. The prosecution submits supplemental discovery, and you got a gag order reaffirmed. All right. But what's being ignored or buried is the FGG chain of custody silence, the digital surveillance timeline, the lack of body cam transparency, DM's delayed 911 timeline is still fuzzy on top of all that. You got the DNA sheath miracle. You got the media narrative control. You got the Kohberger profile problem. We talked about connections. There was an entire media blitz on Dana Smithers at a very convenient time and then completely dropped and never talked about again, the missing woman from Pennsylvania. And I believe it's just complete confirmation bias tactics from the media. And I hate to say that because that does make me, you know, one second. I need to put this on for this rant because
that's amazing.
What I will say is that if you guys don't think that the feds and the media work together to push a narrative across to get things across the finish line, I'm sorry, but if you're not awake to it by now, you probably never will be. I hope that that's not the case. But you look at how Dana Smithers came into the media at that specific time for that amount of time and then to never be shown about like anything about her ever again. Well, it's right when like a very critical piece of confirming Kohberger as this monster was occurring. And I go back to this profile that everybody had on him within hours of the arrest. Like it was like they were prepped and ready. And one of the things that I want to get your thoughts on too, a general thing, is this narrative. If we were to take out the narratives that like myself, you, thousands of other people have talked about, you don't get a narrative this clean unless you build it around somebody. I firmly believe that. So,
well,
yeah.
Let me riff on that a bit if you don't mind. So, one of the things I've stated a million times, and that was awesome. Your hat change, dude. That was badass. Thank you. That's awesome. But one of the things I've stated was here's how the American legal system works, whether you like it or not. And I've said this a million times. The prosecution's job, once they decide who it is that's guilty, their job is to do everything in their power that they can to not allow anything into evidence that is going to cast doubt into the idea that that person is guilty. And the defense, contrary, is also only interested in keeping everything they can out of the jury's view that might make their guy look guilty, right? And neither side, let me say this as clearly as I can, neither side gives a shit what really happened in this situation. That's the jury's job. In the American legal system, the jury is the one to decide who is telling the truth. The prosecution is definitely providing a one-sided, biased opinion where everything they want you to see is only the evidence that makes their guy look guilty, and the defense is going to show you only the things that makes their guy look innocent. And it's the jury's decision to tell who is telling the truth, right? And for better or for worse, that's the way our legal system works. So we are in a situation, like you said, where the prosecution is going to overlook things that they know damn well will be exculpatory to Brian Kohberger. That's going to make him look like he's innocent. And they're going to fight like tooth and nail to make sure that never gets seen by a jury. And conversely, the defense is going to do the same thing. So again, for better or for worse, that's the way our legal system works. Both sides are going to present everything and do every dirty trick they can to make sure that the jury doesn't see anything that might cast reasonable doubt, because neither side really in our system gives a shit what really happens. The prosecution's job is to convict, and the defense's job is to acquit. That's it.
That's it. And I'll take it a step further too. I mean, you have the state paying for Kohberger's defense, and then you have the state paying for Kohberger's prosecution as well. And
right?
Yeah, you know, that is a big aspect of it. I mean, the state is paying for both his defense and both his prosecution. It takes me back to a point that we have yet to talk about, which is the funding that Washington State and Idaho was receiving. Now, this is sourced. Again, I will read this off here. And look, I was so excited. I literally I printed off all of the layouts that I used in my videos so that I didn't have to mess around and click on screen. But here's a fact. These are the facts. Okay. let me just make now, as I say, I don't got to click around. I'm bumbling to find it. All right. So there's an NIJ funded project at Washington State University. It started early 2020, end of 2019, and it ended early 2023. It was the quote for quote was developing forensic models for early threat detection in emerging adults in a non-clinical setting. Okay. Right. So emerging adults, we can all agree that's young adults, college age students, university students.
Yep.
Okay. The metrics that they're looking for: empathy suppression, impulsivity, narcissistic rage, ideation around power and dominance, and it's going to be used as a tool for identifying high-risk behavioral profiles. Now, this is live at the time that Kohberger is a student, and it wasn't voluntary. Okay, students in class were being monitored through their class performance, social interactions outside of the classroom, and then their digital behavior. Let me say this last part twice. And it wasn't voluntary. Students were monitored through class performance, social interactions outside of the classroom, and digital behavior with or without consent. Yes. Now, tell me that's not mind-boggling.
Oh, yeah. Dude, so again, props to you. Props to you, because you're one of the only people bringing this shit out. And you were the first person I heard it from. I'm a firm believer in the idea of follow the money. So when you were talking about $2.2 million, that was a grant from the DOJ to study criminal behavior at WSU. Follow the money. Okay. So now I started, because of you, I said, oh, wait a minute here, hold on. So Brian Kohberger was a psychology student at DeSales University, and something convinced him to change his major to criminology. And he was studying under, Catherine Ramsland, I think, who was the person who wrote the book on BTK. So all of a sudden he applies to WSU. Even his father. Now I'm reading, by the way, and I don't want to shamelessly plug my stuff, but I'm doing a review of Howard Bloom's book, When the Night Comes Falling, about the Brian Kohberger and the Idaho 4 murders. And one of the things he points out was that Michael Kohberger, Brian's father, didn't understand why it was that Brian Kohberger wanted to go to WSU. It's in the middle of fucking nowhere. Pardon my French. It's the middle of nowhere, right? And so he's like, why does my son want to go to WSU? You might have hit on it, because they got a $2.2 million grant to study criminal psychology. And that's what Brian Kohberger was obsessed about. How do I think like a criminal?
Yes, and I'll even take it further. Well, because people are going to be like, well, how the hell did he find out? Well, I don't know. Maybe that his professor is one of the only direct known ties to one of the most infamous serial unalivers that worked extremely closely with the DOJ and the DOD, literally co-authored a book with him. And, it's just like, okay, so then you start to break that down. Is it like, let's just say, because one of the comments that I see on my videos is like, well, that's a stretch. Well, is it a stretch to think that professor might not have said that to her students in passing? And then I also find it extremely interesting that Professor Ramsland has never publicly acknowledged that Kohberger's in any of her classes. Why would you not publicly ever acknowledge it? At least the research that I did as of about 72 hours ago, Professor Ramsland has never once come out to the public and admitted that Brian Kohberger's in her classes. Okay.
So
why?
Yeah, with all due respect to your guest, I'm not attacking your guest, but the question of that's a stretch. What part did they say was the stretch? Because I'd love to address what part was the stretch. What part was the stretch?
I'm saying like one of the things when I go off on that, it wasn't necessarily in the chat, but I'll see it like on my videos where they're like, well, that's a stretch. And I'm like, really? Because do you know how much random shit you'll just hear? Like if you actually like, have you ever heard of the term like NPCs? I'm convinced there are real life NPCs. I'm also convinced that there's people who don't have that voice inside of their head. And I'm not trying to go deep that like the whole simulation of like we live amongst people that don't have consciousness. I don't want to go there, but I will say that it is interesting how many people are not just like very present in their own life. And so they might not pick up on things, and in their life, they might not be hearing comments like that. I mean, it is extremely realistic to think that professor would have known that funding is going to Washington State.
Well, yes, and as an aside, you and I are, generations apart. I'm an old man, but you and I are kindred spirits because I 100% understand this idea of the NPCs, and some people are not really real. Like there's some people who are playing the game and some people who are just NPCs. I totally fucking get it. So thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, there's just this whole thing about Ramsland, and I want to bring up a point in case your viewers haven't heard this before. One of the things that really stunned me early on with Catherine Ramsland and studying the BTK killer was there was a moment in Dennis Rader's arraignment where he was being accused of the crimes, where what he did in court was exactly what Brian Kohberger did. And let me break this down for you in case nobody's heard this before. So
I actually haven't heard this either.
Oh, so Dennis Rader, like Brian Kohberger, when they were having their arraignment for the crimes, were asked all kinds of questions. Are you this? Is your name this? Are you aware of what you're being accused of? Yes, yes, yes. They talked to the judge over and over, back and forth. Both of them did. At the point that the judge said, "And how do you plead to these charges?" Dennis Rader, his attorney, said, "Your Honor, my client has chosen to stand silent." Brian Kohberger did the same thing, exactly. His when he answered all the questions that the judge said, and then when they asked, "How do you plead?" his attorney said, "Your Honor, my client will stand silent." And I went, "Holy shit! Is this an ode to Dennis Rader and the BTK killer? Was he obsessed because he studied under Catherine Ramsland, who literally wrote the book on BTK?" And my mind just kind of went, holy shit, maybe this is. And then you got the date of the killings of the four aligns with Dennis Rader's killings of 4 people in a house. And I started to go down that effing rabbit hole. And like you, and I'll let you have the mic again because this is your show, but like you, I can entertain like 5 different theories at one time. So there's a part of me that says maybe he was obsessed with BTK. Maybe he was trying to emulate his hero, if you will. So that's just something to think about.
No, yeah, that's great. And hey, this is our show at this point, brother. So don't feel like you're hogging the mic. You are, absolutely blowing my mind with a couple of things that you've said tonight. So feel free to, if you're on a roll, go for it. But I got to tell you too, that is one of those things where I didn't know that. And then it's like, well, it's not the only time that there's been similarities in the behavior or the symbolism of what's happened in this case. And I'm curious if you know that the sheriff's department approached the BTK's daughter after the unalivings in Idaho and said, "Hey, have you seen how eerily similar these crimes are?" And how I believe, and when I say this is a quote, this, it's not word for word, but it was along the lines of like, yeah, it is very eerily similar. And it's eerie to think that Brian Kohberger knows who my father is, alluding to knowing that he studied under Ramsland, I would guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, to your credit, again, I feel like I'm just puffing you up all the time, right? But to your credit, you were the one that brought up the whole Carrie, I can't remember her last name, who is daughter of Dennis Rader. And I looked into that after you said it. So you were the one that turned me on to it. And I went and watched Dr. Phil. So Dr. Phil had an interview, right, with the daughter of Dennis Rader. And she was bringing up these connections between her father and the murders that he committed and Brian Kohberger. And a couple things stood out to me that she said, "Hey, look, both my father, Dennis, and Brian Kohberger were around 28 years old. Brian Kohberger apparently turned 28 shortly after the murders. Dennis Rader was 28 at the time that he killed the family of 4. And in what was not his first murder, it was the second murder, I think it was. But anyways, so she was making that connection. And Dr. Phil also pointed out something, by the way, I just want to bring this as a thing. Dr. Phil said, and like Brian Kohberger, your father apparently secreted himself in a closet of the house. And I was like, what the fuck? Like nobody, I hope I don't get you in trouble, but like nobody has said Brian Kohberger was secreted into a closet. It turns out that was completely Dr. Phil on himself riffing on the whole thing. But yes, there were some connections made between Dennis Rader and Brian Kohberger.
It is funny. I got to ask you, just speaking of like Dr. Phil, even just bringing him up, the only dude that I can think of as Dr. Phil is now that comedian that plays Dr. Phil, like on Kill Tony. If you've ever seen that, it's like, that's where my brain goes. So I just, God, but no, it is extremely interesting. And I guess I want to take that Washington, the funding, which kind of got us off onto this tangent, a step further and talk about not only was Washington receiving the funding. For those of people that don't know, Idaho was also at the exact same damn time receiving funding from the same exact research arm of the DOJ, which is the NIJ, on the STOP Act, which was to prevent violent acts of crime from happening on campus. I've said this, and I'll say it again. On top of everything that we've discussed tonight being a weird coincidence, whether or not the unalivings happened, let's now bring the unalivings into it and say, so on top of all of that, we now have a student that goes to the campus that's getting studying or like funding to study exactly what he is essentially. And then at the campus where the victims are at, 4 students are brutally unalived with a single fixed blade knife and one perpetrator. Like, guys, to me, that in itself, you talk about those 2 things, that alone would be one that would have decades long of conspiracies looked into it because of.
So let me say this. One, again, effing kudos to you, man, for breaking that shit open. That's amazing. Good job. I think what I see is close to what you're seeing, but slightly different. So I'm not trying to correct you. And in fact, I'm going to ask you to correct me if I'm wrong about this. From what I understand, when I looked into this, and you were the one that made me look into it, so I didn't even think about this until you brought it up. So you're a badass, by the way. But the $2.2 million funding that the DOJ basically funded in 2020 was huge, right? And studying criminal behavior in a non-clinical, just like you said, in a non-clinical study, right? But the Idaho side about the STOP Act was only, from what I understand, and I want to ask you if it's true or not, only from what I understand, about $23,000. It was a relatively small, it wasn't in the millions, but to your credit, after the Idaho 4 murder, they received millions of dollars in funding after the murders.
Yes, thank you for clarifying.
So I want to get your thoughts on that.
Nope, that is exactly right, and thank you for clarifying that. Which again, if you look into even, I would argue that solidifies it more. Hey, this school, hey, you're going to get their neighboring schools. All right, hey, Washington, you're going to get the funding beforehand. Idaho, you're going to get it after. Because if you think about it, what justification would there be? Like, that is one of those things where it's like, all right, you can pick apart what the government does after years and years and years after, having all this information coming out, stuff uploaded on the internet, all that shit. But if you were to break this down, I mean, that would make more sense, right? Like, of course they're going to get the millions after the fact. It looks legit. It makes sense. Nobody questions it. And I'm not even saying that maybe that's the reason that it happened, but it is a damn giant coincidence sitting right there as well.
Once again, like, at what point do you go, this can't be just a freaking coincidence? As I've always said, follow the money. So again, I can't say it enough. Kudos to you for looking into the money, because again, follow the money is like my main motto. Always follow the money.
Yeah, and with that being said, one of the things that I was a little bit confused about when I started really diving into this funding was I started looking at this survey questions that Kohberger did. Now,
oh yes,
you look at them, it's damn near like I actually have the Reddit questions compared to a DARPA handbook question printed out.
Dude, you're amazing. Yeah.
And so, but what's interesting is the survey, let's clarify, was that survey done while he was at DeSales or was it done while he was at Washington? Okay.
DeSales. And so here's the thing. Dude, you are a badass. I'm going to tell you that. You are a badass. Let me tell you, oh my God. So here's the thing. When you mentioned that, I had to go down the rabbit hole with this. So one of his professors at DeSales University referred to Brian Kohberger as one of their most brilliant students. Only 2 people in their entire career have they recommended to the criminology PhD system, and that was Brian Kohberger and one other. Only 2 people. They thought that Brian Kohberger was a freaking brilliant up-and-coming criminologist. And part of the things that is like you said, his questionnaire that he put on Reddit that the media focuses so much on. Look at this creepy ass questionnaire. Hey, what were you thinking when you committed the murder? What were you thinking beforehand? The media flocked on that. Look at this, proves this guy's psycho. It was effing master's thesis. I'm sorry to shout. It was a master's thesis that he was writing for his class. And his professor said, he's effing brilliant. It was literally out of the book. And you showed me that, brother. That's amazing.
Well, I appreciate it. I love the excitement. And for the people that don't know just how much these questions mirrored each other, let me just read a couple from the Kohberger survey compared to the DARPA N2 equivalent, which is understanding narrative influence. All right. And this is all sourced. I mean, this is stuff that's typically done at like MIT as well. So, for example, Kohberger's survey question is, before making your move, how did you approach your target? The DARPA handbook says, describe how you identified your target and outline the initial sequence of engagement. All right. It's right? Literally DARPA, and the news ran with it. Here's the one that's just, again, hilarious because it totally is like, well, of course you're going to reword that this way. And it was Kohberger's. It was this is the one that everybody jumped on. It was, how did you feel after committing the crime? And the DARPA handbook says, what emotions were activated following the mission completion or target neutralization? And it's just like, it goes everything. Describe your emotional modulation across a timeline of engagement, pre-action, action, and post-action. And then Kohberger says, what's your emotional state before, during, and after? I mean, guys, this is not some weirdo criminology guy that's just posting on Reddit. I mean, there's a reason it's the damn same thing as DARPA. And for people who don't know what DARPA is, I would get like the most layman way to say it is like, it's a third-party subcontractor of black budget type operations.
You said it absolutely correct. DARPA is a known affiliate to the U.S. government. They're basically the government, but they do a lot of funding for kind of government special ops type of stuff. DARPA, and again, I could go on a freaking tangent about DARPA with the whole shooting in 2012 of Aurora, Colorado. But the point being is that, once again, you are spot on in this, and this whole you identifying that the questions that the media latched onto. Look how creepy Brian Kohberger is because he's asking these questions. They are freaking from the DARPA handbook, essentially, on how to basically identify criminal psychology. He's just asking, because it's his master's thesis in criminology, how to think like a criminal. And so he's asking these questions. So it's not proof of guilt. It's not proof of a weird ass twisted mind. It's just simply what somebody would do seeking a master's degree and using the handbook as a guideline of what questions should I ask criminals.
Yeah, no, you absolutely hammered it home. And I would say, too, for the people in the chat that don't know, and this is not meant to insult anybody's intelligence, but it's one of those points where if you don't maybe get told, you wouldn't know, or maybe you would assume. But criminal justice and criminology are not the same study. Okay, criminal justice is the study of like the system, the police, the courts, things like that. Criminology is the study of how criminals think, essentially. So I've always thought that point was extremely weird. It's like, okay, I guess you could say too, it is odd if you didn't know that. Yeah, why would this guy be posting it on Reddit? Like, it's honestly a great point by the media for those people that wouldn't assume if there's a narrative that's wanting to be pushed. However,
and like you said, this is the thing that I hate to interrupt you, but this is exactly what you're talking about. The media wants to focus on these creepy ass questions on Reddit with no context that it was for a master's thesis, that he was literally studying this for his master's thesis. That's what drives me insane, is it's easy to cherry pick when you're the media and you've decided as the media that this guy is guilty. Then you say, oh, this guy was asking all these creepy questions on Reddit. How about context, people? He was submitting those questions as a master's thesis. That was part of his master's degree to get the master's degree. And his professor considered it brilliant. Now, granted, I will say this as a caveat. Howard Bloom in his book said that later that same professor, in retrospect, after the murders, thought maybe there was something more creepy going on. But at the time, when he submitted it, it was freaking brilliance. She was like, this guy's awesome. This guy's an up-and-comer. And it was only after the murders in which he was identified as the main suspect that she thought, oh my gosh, was he trying to think like a criminal? So anyways.
No, it's absolutely true, and I want to also point this part out because, and one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you if this was at Washington or DeSales is because you guys understand that if there is an official type, and this is for Washington, okay? Because I was just curious. I was like, okay, well, is there other surveys, right? Like clearly this guy's now he's going to Washington to study this, but I started thinking, well, what would the process of submitting some sort of survey look like at these colleges? Because if you want credit for it, these surveys, they have to be legitimized by a professor. You can't just go and run your, whatever type of survey when you're going for a thesis or when you're going for a large project. Like it has to go through what's known as, so specific to Washington State's criminal justice and criminology. Their department requires students to submit human behavior research projects to the Institutional Review Board. This is common amongst almost every university. Okay, so that means that if there was a behavioral survey done, this all would have to be reviewed and approved, meaning that faculty would see the questions, knew what he was researching, and let him proceed. Yes. And then that's why I ask that, because let's say that is the case. And then if they really did think this, or if they knew that, and let's say that he got into Washington by doing all of that, well, it had to be legitimized. It had to be something where they could go and look at the transcripts if they were to ever pull it. And the final point that I want to make on that is the school never flagged it. There was no psych eval then. Nobody ever brought it up to him as far as a professor. Reddit, of all places, flagged it for threat behavioral detection. Reddit.
Yeah.
I mean, what the hell are the odds of that too?
So, here's the thing. I mean, more and more our society is being controlled by AI, TikTok in particular, right? So there's not even humans in control of this. So at some point, the AI is looking for keywords and key questions and saying, oh, this is dangerous behavior. So I think the whole flagging a Reddit thing was an AI type thing. A bot basically decided that the questions were mysterious, right? But you're 100% correct in the sense that in order to even conduct that survey that Brian Kohberger did, he had to submit that to his professors as, hey, here's what I want to do. I want to go post on Reddit for people who are former criminals to talk about their mindset of committing a crime. And here's what I want to do. And here's the questions I want to do. And a professor would have reviewed that and would have approved that entire methodology. So again, this isn't just Brian Kohberger on his own going out there and saying, hey, I want to commit a crime. I want to kill a bunch of college students. So let me ask some guys what they were thinking. That's not what happened. What happened was this was submitted to a professor. Here's the questions I want to ask. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Yes, a peer reviews it and says, that's good. Go for it. Let's do that. And so, yeah, that was all approved by somebody at the university level.
Absolutely. And, one of the other things too, just talking about, one of the things that I do want to bring back up is just knowing that area, right? One of the things that I've always just wondered is the connection to the victims. I mean, there's no motive that I've ever heard that would make sense. There's obviously no confession yet. And prior to actually you hopping on, I said, we've seen false confessions before or pressured confessions before. I mean, for God's sakes, if there's ever been a time to give a confession, it's probably when the court system's throwing the book at you. You have the state paying for both sides of your freaking trial. And on top of that, you're facing the death penalty now via firing squad after the first time in 30 years it's been swapped. If there was ever a high pressure situation where it would make sense for someone to crack, it'd probably be then. But knowing that area and that like downtown area, I mean, you can look it up. You can see the videos. I mean, it looks like your classic kind of small town, like kind of towny vibe. Would everybody know everybody?
Oh, yeah. Oh my God, yes. So first of all, so much of what you said, I don't even know where to start. So let me start with Pullman in Moscow. When I went to school at Pullman, Washington, and now I was decades ago. I'm an old man. So decades ago, it turned out that Idaho had a lower drinking age than Washington State. So Washington was 21. I think it was 19 or something like that in Idaho. So it was common for WSU students to go to Idaho to party because they could legally drink in Idaho. So just to keep that as a reference, because of that, the history has always been WSU students go to Idaho to party. That is a common thing. Those two cities, Moscow, Idaho, Pullman, Washington, for those two universities, touch each other by a very, very small distance. And it is common. When I was going to school there, I went over to Moscow, Idaho on a regular basis. So all this BS narrative in the media about Brian Kohberger was in Moscow, Idaho on a regular basis. So is everyone at WSU. That is a common, I'm sorry I shout. People say I shout too much. But anyways, I get passionate about this shit. So let me just clarify that. As a student of WSU, going to Moscow, Idaho is a common thing. Everybody goes to Moscow, Idaho to party. So Brian Kohberger being in Moscow, Idaho, really on the bottom line means shit. It means nothing because everyone from WSU goes to Pullman or goes to Moscow, Idaho for partying. That's a common thing. I feel like there's something I'm missing about your question, but that's one of the things I wanted to get out. Maybe rephrase what you wanted to hear my thoughts on.
No, well, it was more so, not only have I not heard, like I was going kind of off about how I haven't heard a good theory for motive, that one that would make sense outside of like, oh, he's a stalker, he's jealous, he's blah, 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 right? Or I haven't heard really any solid connection to the victims. I mean, I've seen some stuff with like the League of Legends screenshots. I don't know if you've ever seen those floating around, how they could have potentially gamed together. And then if you look into Riot Games, who partnered directly with the DOJ's research arm, the NIJ, for using that game in the anonymous setting to study like teamwork, potential radicalization, communication, things like that. Now, that one is a little bit hard for people that maybe don't understand that type of video game to do, so we don't have to dive into that. Have you come across anything that's at least made you stop and pause and be like, holy hell, that would make sense on how they would be in contact with each other prior?
So, first of all, I heard about that whole League of Legends shit from you. So again, kudos. You're a badass. I know I'm like swinging off your proverbial, you know what, but you're really great. You're really great. So first of all, let me say this: the connections. So the Gonzalez family, Steve Gonzalez, when they first heard that Brian Kohberger was identified as the primary suspect, they immediately jumped on looking for connections between Brian Kohberger and their daughter, Kaylee Gonzalez. What they found was they believed that they found an Instagram, I believe it was, account of Brian Kohberger who was liking photos of Maddie Mogen, not Kaylee Gonzalez, but Maddie Mogen. That was the only connection the family found. Shortly after they discovered that, the entire account for Brian Kohberger was removed from Instagram, and all of that was removed. He was not interested in Kaylee Gonzalez, according to what they saw. Now, where I'm going with all that is, from what I understand, the family, including the Gonzalez family, has indicated that the wounds on Kaylee Gonzalez were more substantial than any other of the victims. It indicated that Kaylee Gonzalez was the target of that attack. There was something personal about Kaylee Gonzalez. Everybody else may have been collateral damage. Kaylee Gonzalez was the focus. And Steve Gonzalez has indicated multiple times that what happened to Kaylee, his daughter, was beyond what anybody else happened. Her wounds were different. Her points of impact, as he called it, were different. What happened to Kaylee was different than everybody else. There is no connection that I have found in all my research between Brian Kohberger and Kaylee Gonzalez, other than a pure speculative, maybe Brian Kohberger was at a bar sometime and hit on Kaylee and she rebuffed him, and so he got pissed off about it. That's pure speculation. There's absolutely no connection to that whatsoever. The only connection that I have even remotely been able to find between Brian Kohberger and any of the victims in the house is maybe he had an Instagram account in which he liked some of the photos of Maddie Mogen. And Maddie Mogen did not get the massive. There's only two people in that case that have ever been accused of having more wounds than anybody else. And that's Xana and Kaylee Gonzalez. Kaylee clearly, I believe, had the most brutal attack, right? So again, if Maddie Mogen was Brian Kohberger's obsession, why does she just get taken out quickly? And why was more time spent on Kaylee Gonzalez? And I before I let you take the mic again, I want to apologize for anybody. This is a very difficult subject. And I understand that these victims are innocent victims. And I understand this is a super difficult conversation to have. But if Kaylee Gonzalez did indeed receive the worst wounds, one has to ask, What did that killer have connection to Kaylee? Why did she get it worse than everyone else? And I see no connection from Brian Kohberger to Kaylee Gonzalez.
And thank you for saying that. I'll echo that, and I will say too, not that I want to go down this rabbit hole, and I'm not going to. Just if you are interested for what my take would be on that theory, I do have a playlist on the right of the twins' ritual that would explain why Kaylee may receive more wounds if it was some sort of planned. You know, you guys, if you follow me, you know I went deep on that, but I have that playlist up. It's at the top of my profile. As you were talking, I started just like looking back, doing like Command F in my notes. I had wrote down like I do everything on Canva. I don't know how you make your content, but Canva for me, the layouts are super simple and it allows me to search really easily then. But I have in like my speculation section is that there was a former Washington State student who was a previous tenant in 2021 who lived in the 1122 King Road house that had mutual classes with Kohberger in his undergrad days at DeSales. So,
oh wow,
now again, that's speculative. Like, to be honest, I've written these notes down, and it's like for example, I had these 3 bullet points: delivered DoorDash, Uber Eats, participated in shared rides, may have attended a party at the house previously or knew somebody who did. And then you look at a student who previously lived at that house that was a prior tenant that reportedly had mutual classes with Kohberger in his undergrad days. Well, I don't know. And like, so it's just like, there's little bits like that I've never been able to actually finish and hammer home, but I'm curious if anybody's ever heard that. And in the chat, if you guys have heard that, I'll peek at the chat. But that's something too where I'm like, okay, well, that's weird.
Well, once again, I have to say, dude, I so admire your mind. Your mind is, you know how to pick up on those. What the fuck? You're like, you hear something, and you're like, what the fuck? Like, and so again, I can't state enough how impressed I am with your brain. So thank you for looking into this, and I will have to do some research now because you have alerted me to something I didn't know. So that's amazing.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'd actually like to do, and first of all, I would love to have you back on. I think the chat's enjoyed you. I've gotten a couple messages pop up on my phone saying that you're effing awesome. So I would love to have you back on. I have Phoenix on regularly. She's great. But Phoenix and you, I might as well send you guys my notes and let you guys just look at how my brain works, because I'd be curious what you guys could come up with, because
I would love that.
There's so many bullet points I have like that I've never finished, or like I've just, ran into a dead end that maybe you guys could. But, the other thing too, as I'm scrolling, is I look at how Kohberger, with him being a PhD level criminology student, he has access to like university tools like open source intelligence, right? If you guys have ever heard of like OSINT as the acronym, OSINT tools, it's used in law enforcement and academia. And what it does is it tracks the digital footprints, the geotagging metadata. It cross-references social behavioral patterns. It lines up exactly with what the NIJ is trying to study. And then I started thinking like, okay, well, if they're doing predictive criminal behavior analysis, like, can they run that in the adjacent town if, like what you said, WSU students unknowingly or unwittingly are participating in this study in a non-clinical setting? And let's say that they go hang out in Moscow. Does that extend that study into that area, even though it's not necessarily at that school? I don't know. But it's just like, then you look at the popular areas like the corner club, the food truck. I mean, does that cross into that where there's like overlap with other types of students knowing that they lived in a party house? Was there people that went to WSU that partied at that house? So you guys are getting a little bit of a glimpse up to like how my brain just runs. But I start thinking like, could that be a reason for pictures on the phone? Meaning it's a part of this study. Maybe it's a part of some sort of like working, or for me, it's a part of some working theory right now. Because one of the things that I am like determined to do is to figure out a way that Kohberger knew these people and what a real potential motive would be. So that's what I'm working on currently.
In my mind, my mind is at a million miles an hour trying to talk to you, and I don't. And again, if we can go on together in the future, I would love it, because I feel like we can't possibly address everything tonight. But I will say this: the federal government, in my opinion, and from my studies, watches universities. They watch up and coming students. They look for brilliant minds in certain areas. So there is a possibility, to kind of go along with a lot of the theories you have, that the government had identified Brian Kohberger as an up-and-coming criminologist and a brilliant mind, and that they might have used him as an asset to try to understand some of the things, because his mind was working in that way, right? So then when you start going into that logic about, well, okay, so Brian Kohberger goes to WSU, which has got a strong criminology history, got a big, huge grant to study things. Was he in some way a government asset in some way? And if he was, at what point will the government go to cover up their asset? Because if it went wrong, if something went wrong, they're like, oh shit. Like, the last thing we want is everybody figuring out that we funded this guy or that we were working with this guy, because it's going to be a huge black eye on the U.S. government, right? So that's my take on that. Just, again, I think in a lot of ways what you're saying is, let's get together as a think tank, right? You share your notes with me. I share my notes with you. Maybe we can come up with some things, because I think the way you think and the way that I think, we might uncover some explosive shit in the future. And I'm looking forward to that possible collaboration.
Dude, I am too. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on, chat. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know that I'm already looking forward to the next time that I have Devil's Advocate on. If you guys don't follow him, you want to go ahead and talk about your website or where they can find you on YouTube?
Yeah, so my website, thank you so much for that, for allowing me that time to do that. So my website is devilsadvocates.info. I have a YouTube channel, Devil's Advocates 2024, for the year 2024 that I started that YouTube channel. I do long form content there. So thank you so much for giving me that opportunity to do that. And again, I can't say enough without sounding super creepy that I really, really appreciate your style and your mind. I think you're brilliant. Again, we may not 100% think alike, but you know what? We both are able to entertain 5 different ideas at the same time. And that's what I appreciate about you. So I hope we get an opportunity to go together again sometime in the future.
I will echo that right back at you, and I'm looking forward to it. For everybody else that did join, just as a reminder, I had to start a brand new YouTube channel less than 48 hours ago, which sucks, but it's Birdie Bombshells. So that's up and running. I did just upload videos, so if it doesn't pop up in the search, that's normal. It takes a little bit. I'll keep plugging that on my videos, but I am as well starting to do long form content officially again in May. And so we have some great ideas coming up for that. Chat, as always, shout out to you guys. Shout out to my mods. Shout out to the great guests that we had on tonight. Can we literally have had somebody who completely matches the energy that I go on and tangents about? And it was incredible to have somebody on there. And I just want to say thank you for coming on here and sharing the perspectives. I agree. It is okay to disagree. It's a giant problem in our society that we do not get past the first initial disagreements. And so it was extremely refreshing to have somebody on here tonight that did so. So with that being said, I hope everybody has a great night. Devil's Advocate, I'll be in contact with you, man. We'll get those notes shared. Same thing to you, Phoenix. If you're still in there, let's all collab on this, and let's keep digging. And then I hope everybody has a great rest of their night. And I will talk to everybody soon. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you, man. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Take
You
it
as well.
easy.
Yep, you too.